Today I have a reading from Enthusiasm Described and Cautioned Against by Charles Chauncey, 18th century Unitarian Congregationalist minister. The word enthusiasm, from its etymology, carries in it a good meaning, but is more commonly used in a bad sense, as intending an imaginary, not real inspiration. Man mistakes the workings of his own passions for divine communications and fancies himself immediately inspired by the Spirit of God, when all the while he is under no influence other than that of an overheated imagination. The cause of this enthusiasm is a bad temperament of the blood and spirits. 'Tis properly a disease, a sort of madness, disorder of exhorting and praying and singing and laughing. 'Tis evidently a breach upon common order and decency, yea, a direct violation of the commandment of God, written on purpose to prevent such disorders. I caution you against giving way to enthusiastic impressions. Make use of the reason and understanding God has given you. 'Tis indeed impossible a man should be an enthusiast who is in the just exercise of his understanding. And 'tis because men don't pay a due regard to the sober dictates of a well-informed mind that they are led aside by the delusions of a vain imagination. Be advised, then, to make use of your reasonable powers, and act not as the horse or the mule, as though you had no understanding. You must not lay too great stress upon the workings of your passions and affections. While the passions are uppermost and bear the chief sway over a man, he is in an unsafe state. None knows what he may be bro to. You can't, therefore, be too careful to keep your passions under the regimen of a sober judgment. 'Tis indeed a matter of necessity, as you would not be led aside by delusion and fancy. There is no such thing as real religion, let the conduct of men be what it will, and 'tis in its nature a sober, calm, and reasonable thing. And the next reading, We Are Tired of Secret Joy by Rumi, translated by Coleman Barks. With the sacredness you give and describe, turn us upside down, that other people may know you are here. We are tired of secret joy, bashfulness, and being ashamed. Reasons for holding back fly off like doves. You speak your subtle truth to this ring of blank faces, and someone suddenly finds something in a pile of ashes. Why am I talking? You know what is happening. Simply say it. Walk around to each of us and pour the wine and spoon out that eggplant fricassee concoction.
I gave her some readings this week. The first time I walked into the little chapel on J Street, I was terrified. The usher greeted me warmly, and I chose a seat somewhere in the back. And I was feeling awkward by myself. There weren't any hymnals or an order of service to browse. And so I took out my phone and had an extremely engaging text message conversation with nobody. And soon, the pianist and the drummer and the keyboard player came in and started warming up. And slowly, over the next few minutes, the music started gathering steam. And before long, everyone in the chapel was up out of their seats and moving and clapping and singing along and totally engaged. I looked around and realized that not only was I the only white person in the crowd, I was also the only one who didn't know the words to all of the songs. And then seeing this poor fish out of water that I was, and bless her heart, this lady in front of me, she's sitting there, she stands up, she walks back from her row to mine, puts an arm around me, and hands me a tambourine. And says, "It doesn't matter if you know the words, honey, you just have to play along." This was not a Unitarian Universalist church, as you might have gathered from my description. This was Imani United Church of Christ in Sacramento, California. And I had gotten there because of a chance encounter with a woman in the parking lot of an IKEA. She was a middle-aged black woman, obviously gay to me. And we started talking. She had her dogs there. And my partner, Karen, was inside the IKEA. And as soon as Karen came out and she put us together, saw that I was one half of an interracial queer couple, this woman next to us goes, "Oh, y'all need to come down to the church." And that is the story of how I got evangelized. So that night, I went to Imani's website, as, by the way, most people do before ever setting foot in a church these days. And I found out that this congregation was largely black, largely gay, theologically liberal, with a Baptist, Methodist, Catholic, Pentecostal kind of worship style. It was a little out of my comfort zone, lifelong Unitarian Universalist that I am, but I wanted a place to go to worship while I was on my ministerial internship that wasn't my own congregation. And these folks had great music, good theology, and met on a Sunday evening, so I could go. So a few weeks later, there I was. Now, to be honest, my first few weeks with Imani were a little rough. Not only did I have the nagging feelings of guilt of being a lifelong Unitarian Universalist worshiping with some other denomination, but I also came in with all of the prejudices about Christianity that I had acquired by being a lifelong Unitarian Universalist. So all the things about clapping and shouting and amening and singing, I was very, very nervous about it. And as that reading today shows, I came by this skepticism very honestly. Throughout the history of both our Unitarian and our Universalist heritage, our religious ancestors have been some of the most vocally opposed to emotional religion. And they've been some of the fiercest protectors of the quiet, intellectual style of worship that has marked our tradition for more than 400 years. The piece that Liz read earlier was from an 18th century Congregationalist minister. They didn't use the word Unitarian until sort of the middle half of the 19th century, but he was a Congregationalist, and he was definitely one of our ancestors. Charles Chauncey lived at a watershed moment in American history, the period that we now refer to as the First Great Awakening. In the 1730s and 40s, this great religious fervor swept the country, the colonies, in fact. And instead of worshiping in their little local congregations, as people had always done before that, with their pastors who had been their pastors for 50, 60, 70 years, now there were these itinerant preachers coming to town, riding in on their horses and hosting these big, outdoor, public, exciting worships. And you can imagine that the folks in the churches were not so excited about this. The most famous of these itinerant preachers was Jonathan Edwards, who, if you remember your high school literature, wrote Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. You remember that? Now that sermon, of course, is a particular kind of the theology, but the imagery, the emotionalism of that was characteristic of the style of the Great Awakening. And those folks were known as the New Lights, or the Revivalists. And instead of talking and preaching and doing worship about God, their goal was to get people to experience a relationship with God in worship. And sometimes this manifested in what Chauncey described as the disorder of exhorting and praying and singing and laughing, all in the same service. Now, Chauncey and his friends were called the Old Bricks. I'm serious. And they were the traditionalists, and they were appalled by this. To be fair, poor old Chuck Chauncey wasn't entirely the stick in the mud that we might like to think he was. His point wasn't that people shouldn't have an emotional experience that engaged the heart and the body in worship. It was that he was afraid that this new style was engaging only the heart to the exclusion of reason. One of our most deeply held tenets as Unitarian Universalists is that humans have been endowed with the gifts of reason and conscience, and that we are called to use those gifts in discernment of our own religious truth. It's why we don't read the Bible or any other religious scripture literally. It's why we are such supporters of education. It's why one of our sources, which are those things right under our 7 principles in the front of our hymnal, one of our 6 sources is humanist teachings, which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. We've inherited deep gifts from our ancestors who fought for reason and thoughtfulness over manipulative emotionalism and shallow theology. But somewhere along the way, the pendulum swung too far. We accepted the idea that the mind and the heart are actually separate things. It comes from the ancient Greek philosophers, and it's gotten carried down. We accepted the idea that worship should reflect that division. Now, the Unitarians bought into this from the beginning. You can trace that from Chauncey on down to today. The Universalists, who you remember did not merge with the Unitarians until the 1960s, the Universalists were a little bit slower to jump on that bandwagon. During the Second Great Awakening, which lasted from the 1700s, the late 1700s until about 1840, now during that time the Universalists were out evangelizing on the prairies and out on the frontier, just like the Methodists and the Baptists and the other denominations who were out doing that. And in fact, they were so far from the staid, reserved traditionalists that the Unitarians were, that the Unitarians called the Universalists backwater emotionalist country bumpkins. I thought they were uneducated and didn't have anything to offer. But even the Universalists didn't sponsor these big revivals and camp meetings that the Methodists and the Baptists were putting on. My colleague Alan Taylor at Unity Temple in Chicago writes in a paper that the Universalists sought to remove the scales of irrationality and affirm faith grounded in love rather than fear, all the while promoting an egalitarian communal vision. Universalist evangelists often set up their gatherings as debates or arguments for universal salvation where people got to speak with one another. They did not fervently pray to transform each other, but instead relied on reason to convert others. My friends, we live and worship in a world shaped by this legacy and by its inadequacy. The yearning for that experience of the holy, not just about the holy, is what brought me to Imani that day. And it's what brings people out of Unitarian Universalist congregations every day. We're not alone. This is happening in all of the mainline denominations, the Protestants, the Catholics, the Episcopalians, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians. everybody is bleeding membership right now. The statistics show that the fastest growing religious demographic in the U.S., you know this one? The nuns, and that's N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. That's a whole nother sermon. The nuns are the folks who are affiliated with no particular religious tradition. And now, meanwhile, across the globe, groups that can trace their lineage back to those New Light revivalists, in particular the evangelicals and the Pentecostals, are growing faster than any other denomination. Now, for those of us who find ourselves on the religious and political left, from UUs to progressive Catholics to Reconstructionist Jews, we're generally terrified of this. I'm guilty of this as anyone. When I hear evangelical or Pentecostal, I think homophobia and sexism and megachurch pastors with snakeskin shoes spouting theology that says that everybody but the people in their own pews are going to hell. Now, my friends, that is an emotional reaction that I have. And it's valid because, let me tell you, there are plenty of Christians out there, conservative Christians, who are praying for me every single day to get saved from my heathen homosexual ways. But then, after I have that emotional reaction, the calm, reasoned ghost of Charles Chauncey comes and sits like an angel on my shoulder and says, Ashley, use your reason. Our neighbors and friends who are members of these faith traditions are not stupid. They are not all hateful, and they are not all alike. So then that makes me ask, what are these millions and millions of people who attend these churches, large and small, what are they getting there that keeps them coming back? What might we learn from them? Not to get new faces in our pews, but to help us get ourselves out of a religious rut that might actually be preventing us from experiencing a more meaningful spiritual life. I'm not talking theology. I'm not suggesting that anybody convert or accept the problematic and harmful exclusion and bigotry that certain strains of conservative Christian theology, of Pentecostalism and evangelicism have brought. Those are unacceptable, and I am not asking you to embrace those. But what I am asking you to try on for a moment this morning is to think about some of the things, two practices in particular, that are traditionally associated with evangelical and Pentecostal Christianity that I think hold some important wisdom for us today. If it makes you uncomfortable, good. That's what I'm trying to do, get you to think. And I'm asking you just to try it on for a little while, and we'll see how it goes. You might have noticed that my sermon this morning is called Born Again Universalism, an Altar Call for Love. And I bet a couple of you raised your eyebrows when you saw that in the newsletter this month. But that first practice I want us to consider today is, in fact, the altar call. So I want to get a sense of who's in the room. Did any of you grow up or were members of a religious tradition where an altar call was a part of the service on a regular basis? Okay.
What's an altar call?
Well, there we go. We'll get there. So very few of the folks in this room are part of that tradition. An altar call is the time usually right after the sermon when the preacher invites anyone who wants to come forward and commit themselves to the church and proclaim their faith in God. It's a very, very distant cousin to our Unitarian Universalist practice of signing the membership book. So the history of the altar call is that it started with this thing called the anxious bench. And the anxious bench was that the idea was that in any given congregation, especially these big giant revivals, there would be some people who were saved and some people who had not yet been saved. And the preacher then also knew that among those who had not been saved, and I'm sorry, this half of the room, I'm not saying anything about your condition here. They said that among those who had not yet been saved, there were the folks who were actually grappling with questions of faith wanting to know what they believed and what they wanted for their lives. And then there were the people who were just there for the show. They liked the tambourines and the rolling on the ground and the whole thing. They were there for curiosity. So the pastor would invite the folks who were actually in discernment to come forward, and there would be a bench right here by the altar where those people could sit. And then the preacher would preach directly to them for part of the service, and then would invite them to stay afterward for more discussion and questioning and education. Now, this is a practice that has been passed down in some ways in two forms. The first is the mourner's bench that you will see in some versions of Baptist churches, Pentecostal churches, where people who are going through spiritual transitions, that's to say people who are in a time of doubt or dealing with really difficult circumstances or maybe have lost somebody and are grieving. The idea is that those people, there's always a pew reserved out the front of the sanctuary because their stuff belongs there. The theology is that you bring your mess and the congregation will hold you and God will hold you. The other practice that's been passed down is this public conversion. The altar call has now become this time when the preacher invites people to come forward. This is the time when people speak of being born again in Jesus Christ. And what's so powerful about the altar call is that it says to the people, at any moment, anyone can choose a new direction for their lives. It says that they can be in relationship with what is most meaningful and most sacred, and with the community of people who are on the same journey. It says that your stuff, your issues, are indeed belonging right down here in the center of that community. And whatever we might disagree with about the theology, there is something magnetic and radically opening and radically welcoming about that kind of invitation. Now, the altar call is also closely linked with a second practice, that of testifying. So if the altar call is a public declaration of a new and deeper relationship with God, testifying is a public declaration of what that relationship is doing in your life, what it looks like in real time. So in some churches, people who have just been saved will come forward and speak about what got them there. In other churches, there's a whole section of the worship that's set aside for people to come forward and testify about how God sustained them through a crisis, or how prayer brought them clarity about a hard situation, or how much gratitude they have for the blessings of a better job or a new baby. In the words of my colleague, the Reverend Justin Schroeder, a First Universalist in Minneapolis, our Unitarian Universalist joys and concerns contain echoes of this practice, including their highly democratic nature. However, our joys and concerns seem mundane in comparison to the power of prayerful Pentecostal testifying. I know the vocabulary is really different, that the theology seems really far away from the broad inclusivity that most of us have experienced in Unitarian Universalism. And getting up and sharing that passionately, that emotionally to a group of people that you don't always know that well, I don't see that very often, not in our churches. And my guess is, unless you grew up Pentecostal or evangelical, you haven't seen it in other mainline churches either. But that year at Imani, I had the privilege, and I use that word very consciously, I had the privilege of witnessing that kind of testimony. It was scary to me at first because it was emotional and unfamiliar and unpredictable. There were people who would come forward and share their stories for 5, 10, 15 minutes at a time. They would break down in tears. People would raise their hands in praise. People would come forward and literally hold each other up. This is not following an order of service, people. Lest you get scared, I am not advocating that we try and mimic or misappropriate the practices of other religious traditions, but I want to suggest to you today that And to all of us, regardless of our theology or our religious background, that what the world desperately needs is for more of us to answer an altar call. You can call it the interconnected web, or the spirit of life, or universal love, or even God. But there are 1,000 different names, all of which are true. But that thing, that sacred mystery in which we live and move and have our being, that thing that makes of us as individuals together something that is greater than the sum of our parts, that thing is standing down at the altar and it is saying to us, look around. There is so much pain and alienation and suffering in this world. You are drowning in it. Your kids are gunning each other down in the streets. Your corporations are systematically crushing their workers and poisoning the planet. Your prisons are expanding, and your people are fragmented by race and class and national origin and faith. You will not survive if you lose your hope. If you commit yourselves to anything other than this highest of callings, which is to do what you can, where you are, with what you have. To make peace, create justice, to resist that greatest of all illusions, that you are in some way separate from any other part of creation. The only way you will get saved, that voice says to us, is to promise yourselves to the sticky, fierce, uncompromising, difficult, heartbreaking, life-saving love. And the only way you will save each other is to take the risk of coming forward, ready to devote your lives together to manifesting love in this world, even in the face of all that would destroy it. So, it says to us, come on down. And once we've risked answering that altar call, my friends, what does the world need of us? It needs us to testify. It needs us to tell each other the stories of how we are using our own lives as amplifiers of creators of love, and how we have been saved by that love ourselves. Do you teach kids? And maybe you make it your mission to make sure they leave your classroom kinder and more empowered than they were when they walked in the door? Testify to that. Did you get sober? Did you get divorced or mourn the death of a child and discover after the pain subsided that grace and abundance still had not abandoned you? Testify to that. Do you show up for immigrants or write letters to prisoners or work to stop sexual violence, witnessing with your body and your voice that even the most marginalized people among us are not alone? Testify to that. Did you realize that your heart was broken by the violence and the greed and the indifference that you saw on the television? And so one day you turned off the news and you went out into your backyard and you planted squash and tomatoes and strawberries and they grew, and then you shared them with your neighbor and that saved your life? Testify to that. As the poet says, we are tired of secret joy, bashfulness, and being ashamed. Reasons for holding back fly off like doves. You speak your subtle truth to this ring of blank faces, and someone suddenly finds something in a pile of ashes. There is a place at the altar, my friends, for each and every one of us. Love's call will be our savior, and its transformative power will be our testimony. Let us speak it with courage and unapologetic joy. May it be so. Blessed be Ashe and Amen. Let's sing, folks.